In a small town divided by prejudice, the Carter family mourns the loss of their son Elijah, a decorated black soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. As they prepare for his funeral, tensions rise when their neighbor Mrs. Whitaker's deep-seated racism threatens to disrupt their chance to properly honor their fallen hero. With the community already on edge, the stage is set for an explosive confrontation that will test the limits of grief, forgiveness, and human dignity. Will the Carters find the strength to rise above hatred in their darkest hour? Or will Mrs. Whitaker's actions tear apart a community already fragile with loss? Stay tuned to find out. But before that, comment where you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows through the living room window of the Carter family home, where James Carter stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping a silver picture frame. Inside it, his son Elijah smiled proudly in his military dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. The photo had been taken just 6 months ago, before his final deployment. Angela Carter approached her husband quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The touch made him flinch slightly. He'd been lost in thought again. "I keep thinking he's going to walk through that door," James whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Keep thinking I'll hear his laugh again." Angela squeezed his shoulder, fighting back her own tears. "Me too, James. Me too." The silence between them was heavy with shared grief, broken only by the tick-tock of the grandfather clock Elijah had helped his father restore years ago. Everything in the house seemed to hold a memory now. The military liaison called again. Angela said softly, "They want to know if we've decided about the honor guard for the funeral." James nodded slowly, still staring at the photo. "He deserves every honor they can give him. Our boy died serving his country. He died a hero." Down the hallway, Maya Carter stood in the doorway of her brother's bedroom, one hand pressed against the doorframe, as if she needed it for support. The room was exactly as Elijah had left it. Bed made with military precision, his high school football trophies lined up on the shelf, and his collection of model planes hanging from the ceiling. On his desk, a stack of letters he'd written home during his service lay neatly bound with a rubber band. Her eyes caught on the medals and certificates mounted on the wall. Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, each one telling a story of her brother's bravery. Now they were just pieces of metal and paper, poor substitutes for the vibrant life they'd lost. "I miss you so much, big brother," Maya whispered, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly as she heard footsteps behind her. "Maya," her mother called softly. "Honey, there are more people here with food." The steady stream of visitors had been constant since the news arrived. The community had rallied around them, bringing casseroles, flowers, and condolences. Everyone except their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker. Across the street, Mrs. Whitaker stood at her own window, lips pursed in disapproval as she watched another car pull up to the Carters' house. The visitors, a young couple carrying a covered dish, hurried up the walkway. "Ridiculous," she muttered, adjusting her lace curtains. "You'd think they'd lost royalty, not just another." She cut herself off, but her expression said what she wouldn't voice aloud. Her prejudices ran deep, unchanged by decades of social progress. Outside, Tom and Sarah Mitchell, who lived 2 doors down, watched Mrs. Whitaker's silhouette in the window as they walked past her house. "Did you hear what she said at the grocery store yesterday?" Sarah whispered to her husband. "About how some people were making too much fuss over a soldier who was just doing his job." Tom's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and I heard worse. Betty from church told me she was complaining about all the flags being lowered to half-mast. Said it was excessive. I'm worried she's going to cause trouble at the funeral," Sarah said, glancing back at the Whitaker house. "You know how she gets when she thinks she's being righteous about something. If she does, she'll have the whole town to answer to," Tom replied firmly. "The Carters don't deserve that. Not now." Inside the Carter home, James had moved to the dining room, where Elijah's dress uniform lay spread out on the table. He ran the iron carefully over the sleeve, making sure every crease was perfect. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, but his movements were deliberate and focused. "Remember how proud he was when he first put this on?" Angela asked, arranging a collection of photos nearby. Each one captured a moment in their son's life. His high school graduation, basic training graduation, his promotion ceremony. Her fingers lingered on a candid shot of Elijah laughing with Maya at last year's Christmas dinner. Said he'd never felt more like himself than in uniform. James replied, his voice thick with emotion. Our boy knew exactly who he wanted to be, right from the start. In her bedroom upstairs, Maya sat cross-legged on her bed, a notebook open in her lap. She'd been trying to write a poem for the funeral, but the words kept blurring as tears filled her eyes. Dear Elijah, she read softly, testing the words. You were more than just my brother. You were my protector, my friend, my hero. Her voice cracked on the last word. She remembered how Elijah had always stood up for her, whether it was against schoolyard bullies or Mrs. Whitaker's snide comments about their family. He taught her to hold her head high, to be proud of who she was. You will always be my hero, she whispered, the words coming straight from her heart. She wrote them down quickly, then hugged the notebook to her chest. Outside, Mrs. Whitaker had moved to her garden, aggressively pruning her rose bushes while keeping one eye on the Carter's house. She yanked out a weed with particular force as another car pulled up. Shameful display, she muttered, loud enough for passing neighbors to hear. Acting like he was something special. Just another soldier who couldn't dodge a bullet. Her words carried on the breeze to where Lisa Thompson and her husband Mark were walking their dog. Lisa's face reddened with anger, but Mark put a restraining hand on her arm. She's not worth it, he whispered. Save your energy for supporting the Carters. The day wore on, and as the sun began to set, the neighborhood grew quiet. The stream of visitors slowed, leaving the Carter family alone with their grief and their preparations for tomorrow's funeral. In the kitchen, Angela organized the photos they would display at the service. Her hands shook slightly as she arranged them in chronological order. Elijah as a grinning toddler, as a serious middle schooler, as a proud new recruit. Each image was a knife to her heart, a reminder of all the future photos that would never be taken. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. For a moment, they stood together in silence, drawing strength from each other. He knew, Angela, James said softly. He knew how much we loved him. Angela leaned back against him, letting out a shaky breath. I hope he wasn't afraid. At the end, our boy was brave, James assured her, his voice firm despite the tears in his eyes. He lived brave, and I believe he died brave. Upstairs, Maya had finally finished her poem. She stood in front of her mirror, practicing the delivery, trying to keep her voice steady. You taught me strength, she read. You showed me courage. In a world that sometimes tried to make us small, you stood tall. You will always be my hero, big brother, always and forever. As darkness fell, Mrs. Whitaker stood at her window one last time, watching as the lights went out one by one in the Carter house. Her face was set in lines of bitter judgment as she observed the American flag hanging from their porch, gently waving in the evening breeze. They all think he was special, she muttered to herself, turning away from the window. But he was just another soldier who got himself killed playing hero. Tomorrow they'll see. All this fuss over nothing. The night settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket. In the Carter house, each family member lay awake in their beds, their thoughts with Elijah. James stared at the ceiling, remembering teaching his son to throw a football. Angela clutched Elijah's old teddy bear, which she'd found tucked away in his closet. Maya reread old text messages from her brother, his words of encouragement and love bringing fresh tears to her eyes. And across the street, Mrs. Whitaker sat in her darkened living room, her prejudices festering in the silence, planning how she would make her feelings known at tomorrow's service. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was subdued. Early risers shared somber nods as they collected their newspapers or walked their dogs. The upcoming funeral weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Mrs. Whitaker watched from behind her curtains as the first visitors began to arrive at the Carter's house. Family members who had traveled from out of town, military personnel in crisp uniforms, neighbors coming to offer support before the service. Her lip curled in disdain as she observed the gathering crowd. Look at them all, she muttered, arms crossed tightly across her chest, acting like he was some kind of saint just because he wore a uniform. As if that changes anything. The sun rose fully over the horizon, promising a beautiful day that stood in stark contrast to the somber occasion. The Carter family emerged from their house, dressed in black, their faces composed but their eyes revealing the depth of their pain. They would face this day together, just as they had faced everything else. But as they climbed into the waiting car that would take them to the church, none of them could have predicted just how much their strength would be tested, or how their response to hatred would impact not just their own healing, but the entire community's understanding of grace under fire. The stage was set for a day that would change everything. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church, casting colorful shadows across the pews already filling with mourners. Outside, the American flag flew at half-mast, gently rippling in the autumn breeze. The church's old brick walls had witnessed countless services over the years, but today's funeral would prove to be unlike any other. The black limousine carrying the Carter family pulled up to the church entrance precisely at 10 o'clock. James Carter stepped out first, his normally proud shoulders bearing the weight of his grief. He turned to help Angela, who emerged wearing a simple black dress and clutching a white handkerchief. Maya followed, her young face showing a maturity beyond her years. As they walked up the church steps, the assembled mourners parted respectfully. Neighbors, friends, and fellow church members offered silent nods of support. Several military personnel in dress uniforms stood at attention, their faces solemn. "The Petersons are here from Atlanta," Angela whispered to James, spotting their old friends. "They drove all night to be here." "Elijah would be touched," James replied softly, his voice catching slightly. He always said the Petersons were his second family. Inside the church, the front area had been transformed into a tribute to Elijah's life and service. His dress uniform, meticulously pressed by his father, was displayed on a stand next to the altar. The medals gleamed under the church lights, each one representing a moment of valor, of service, of sacrifice. A large photograph of Elijah in his uniform stood centered behind the display, his smile radiating the warmth and confidence that had made him so beloved. 5 veterans, representing different branches of the military, stood at attention near the uniform. As the Carters approached, they simultaneously raised their hands in a crisp salute. The gesture brought fresh tears to Angela's eyes. "At ease, gentlemen," James said softly, returning their salute. "Thank you for honoring our son." One of the veterans, an older man with silver hair, stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Carter served with my nephew in Afghanistan. He said your son was the finest soldier he'd ever known, brave, compassionate, and always putting others first." Maya touched the sleeve of Elijah's uniform gently. "It still smells like his cologne," she whispered to her mother, who pulled her close. The church continued to fill as more mourners arrived. The mayor and his wife, Elijah's high school teachers, his former football coach, and dozens of community members filed in quietly. In the back pew, barely noticed at first, sat Mrs. Whitaker, her face set in its usual expression of barely concealed disdain. As the service began, Reverend Johnson stepped up to the pulpit. "We gather today to celebrate the life of Staff Sergeant Elijah James Carter," he began, his deep voice filling the church. "A son, a brother, a soldier, and a hero who gave his life in service to his country." The congregation sat in respectful silence as the Reverend spoke about sacrifice, duty, and love. Then it was time for James Carter to deliver the eulogy. He stood slowly, straightening his tie, and made his way to the pulpit. Angela squeezed his hand as he passed, giving him strength. "My son," James began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "was more than just a soldier. He was a light in this world. From the time he was a little boy, Elijah knew what it meant to stand up for what's right." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "I remember when he was 12, he came home with a black eye. Some kids had been bullying a younger student, and Elijah stepped in to protect him. When I asked him why he'd put himself in harm's way, he said something I'll never forget. 'Someone has to stand up, Dad. Someone has to be brave.'" James's voice cracked slightly, but he continued. "That's who Elijah was, someone who stood up, someone who was brave." He carried that same spirit into his military service. His commanding officer told me that Elijah saved 3 of his fellow soldiers in his final act of bravery. That was my boy, always thinking of others, always ready to help, always willing to sacrifice. Tears began to fill his eyes, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The church was absolutely silent, every person there sharing in his grief. Angela's shoulders shook with silent sobs as Maya held her hand tightly. From the back of the church came a barely audible scoff, but most were too focused on James to notice. After collecting himself, James continued. Elijah believed in the best of people. He believed in service, in duty, in love. He believed that every person, regardless of their race, religion, or background, deserved respect and dignity. That's what he fought for. That's what he died for. As James returned to his seat, Angela stood and walked to the photograph of their son. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing his smile. Her back was straight, her head held high, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Every person in that church could feel a mother's love and loss in that simple gesture. Then it was Maya's turn. The 16-year-old approached the pulpit with trembling hands clutching her notebook. She took a deep breath, looking out at the congregation. I wrote this for my brother, she said, her voice small but clear. To my brother, who stood tall when others wouldn't, who taught me strength when the world showed weakness, who loved without condition and served without question. From the back of the church, Mrs. Whitaker's voice cut through the reverent silence. Why all this fuss over him? Several people turned in shock, but Maya tried to continue. You were my protector, my friend. He got what he deserved. Playing hero. Mrs. Whitaker's voice rang out louder, bitter and harsh. She stood up, her arms crossed, her face twisted with prejudice. Acting like he was special just because he wore a uniform. He was just another. How dare you? A veteran in the third row shot to his feet, his face red with anger. He was a tall man, his chest covered in medals. That young man died protecting your freedom to spew this hatred. The church erupted into chaos. People began standing, voices raised in anger and dismay. Get her out of here, someone shouted. Show some respect, called another. This is a house of God. Reverend Johnson tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the commotion. Mrs. Whitaker remained standing, defiant. I have every right to speak my mind. All this ceremony for. Enough! The word cut through the chaos like a knife. James Carter had risen, his eyes locked with Mrs. Whitaker's. The church fell silent. His face was hard as stone, but his voice remained controlled. My son believed in the dignity of every person, even those who didn't believe in his. Angela gripped his hand tightly, her fingers white with tension. Her other hand reached for Maya, who had retreated from the pulpit, tears streaming down her face. James, Angela whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. Remember what Elijah would want. The tension in the church was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several of the veterans looked ready to physically remove Mrs. Whitaker, while others in the congregation sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed, but she didn't lower her gaze. I won't apologize for speaking the truth as I see it. Then I pity you, James replied, his voice heavy with both anger and sadness. Because the truth my son died for, the truth about equality, dignity, and service to others, that's a truth you'll never understand. Angela stood beside her husband, her quiet strength evident in her posture. This is our son's funeral, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church. And we will honor him with the dignity he deserves. The congregation murmured in agreement. Several people near Mrs. Whitaker moved away from her, leaving her standing alone in her corner of the church. Reverend Johnson stepped forward again. Mrs. Whitaker, I must ask you to leave. This is a time of mourning and respect. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. But faced with the united front of the congregation, Mrs. Whitaker gathered her purse and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. As she reached the door, she turned back one last time, but whatever she might have said was cut off by the collective glare of the mourners. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya, still standing near the pulpit, wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, a gesture so reminiscent of her brother that several people caught their breath. May I finish my poem? She asked, her voice stronger now. James and Angela nodded, returning to their seats. The congregation settled, and Maya began again. To my brother, who stood tall when others wouldn't, who taught me strength when the world showed weakness, who loved without condition and served without question. You were my protector, my friend, my hero. In a world that sometimes tried to make us small, you showed me how to stand tall. Your light will never fade, your courage never forgotten, your love forever carried in our hearts. You will always be my hero, big brother, always and forever. The church was silent for a moment before erupting in gentle applause. Angela and James held each other, tears streaming down their faces, but their expressions showed pride mixing with their grief. As the service continued, the interruption seemed to have united the congregation even more strongly in their support of the Carter family. The atmosphere, though still heavy with grief, now carried an additional element of protective love and community solidarity. The rest of the funeral proceeded with dignity and grace, just as Elijah would have wanted. But the events of that day would continue to ripple through the community, forcing everyone to confront their own prejudices and preconceptions, and testing the limits of forgiveness and understanding in ways none of them could have anticipated. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the church steps as mourners filed out of Elijah Carter's funeral service. The air was thick with tension, faces marked by a mixture of grief and barely contained anger. Small groups formed on the lawn, their voices a steady hum of disbelief and outrage. Sarah Mitchell stood with her husband Tom, shaking her head in disgust. In all my years in this town, I've never seen anything like it. To disrupt a soldier's funeral. Did you see James Carter's face? Betty Williams interjected, her voice trembling. The dignity of that man, even after what she said about his son. A few feet away, Colonel Richardson, one of the military veterans who had attended, spoke quietly with the Reverend Johnson. Something needs to be done about this. That woman can't be allowed to just walk away from this. The Carters emerged last, surrounded by a protective circle of family and close friends. Local news crews, who had been covering the funeral of the fallen hometown hero, surged forward, microphones extended. Mr. Carter, do you have any comment about Mrs. Whitaker's disruption? How do you respond to her statements about your son? James Carter paused, looking at his wife and daughter. Angela nodded slightly, and he turned to face the reporters. The crowd fell silent, waiting. My son, he began, his voice strong despite the emotion in his eyes, believed in the power of love over hate. He believed that every person, regardless of their background, deserved respect and dignity, even those who showed none in return. He paused, gathering his thoughts. We can't fight hate with hate. My son stood for more than this. He gave his life protecting the very freedoms that allow people to speak their minds, even when their words cause pain. But with freedom comes responsibility. Responsibility to our community, to our shared humanity. Tears glistened in his eyes, but his voice remained steady. Elijah's legacy isn't about anger or division. It's about service, about standing up for what's right, about bringing people together. That's what we choose to focus on today. The cameras flashed as James put his arm around Maya, who was trying to maintain her composure. Angela stood tall beside them, her quiet strength evident in her bearing. Later that evening, inside the Carter home, Maya's carefully maintained control finally broke. She paced the living room, her hands clenched into fists. How could she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. How dare she dishonor Elijah's memory like that? He protected people like her, people who hated him without even knowing him. James looked up from his chair, his face etched with concern. Maya, sweetheart. No, Dad. Don't tell me to be calm. Don't tell me to take the high road. Maya's voice rose with each word. Elijah deserved better than this. He deserved respect. James stood and crossed the room, placing his hands on his daughter's shoulders. You're right. He did deserve better. But remember what your brother always said about anger. Maya's shoulders slumped slightly. That it burns the one holding it. Exactly. Don't let her take your peace, baby girl. Don't let bitterness consume you. That's not what Elijah would want. Across town, the community's response was taking shape. The local park filled with neighbors carrying candles and American flags. Someone had erected a temporary memorial. Elijah's photograph surrounded by flowers and notes of gratitude. Sarah Mitchell, who had organized the vigil, addressed the gathered crowd. Tonight, We stand together to honor Staff Sergeant Elijah Carter. We stand to show that hate has no place in our community. We stand to show the Carter family that they are not alone. From her window, Mrs. Whitaker watched the growing crowd in the park. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on her face as she stood, arms crossed, unable to look away. Several people glanced toward her house, their faces hard with disapproval. Her phone rang again, the 5th time that hour, but she ignored it. Her Facebook page had exploded with angry messages. Her email inbox was flooded with condemnation. She jumped at a knock at her door. 2 police officers stood on her porch, their expressions serious. Officer Jenkins, whom she'd known for years, spoke first. "Mrs. Whitaker, we need to discuss your conduct at today's funeral service." She lifted her chin defiantly. "I have every right to speak my mind. Freedom of speech." "Ma'am," the second officer interrupted, "while you do have the right to free speech, disrupting a funeral service is a different matter. This is a formal warning about your disruptive conduct. This is ridiculous. I was merely expressing my opinion in a public space." Officer Jenkins shook his head. "Mrs. Whitaker, your actions today caused significant distress to a grieving family and disrupted a solemn ceremony. Consider this a warning. Any further disruptions could result in more serious consequences." Back at the Carter home, Angela sat alone in Elijah's room, a box of his letters spread across his bed. Her fingers traced his handwriting, tears falling onto the paper. "Dear Mom," she read softly, "don't worry about me. I'm doing important work here, making a difference. That's all I've ever wanted, to leave the world a little better than I found it." Another letter. "Tell Maya to keep her head up. People might try to bring her down, but she's stronger than they know. We both are. Dad taught us that." The words blurred as fresh tears fell. Angela clutched the letters to her chest, her grief overwhelming her in the quiet of the night. Online, the story was spreading rapidly. Local news websites posted videos of Mrs. Whitaker's outburst and Mr. Carter's dignified response. Social media exploded with posts from people who knew Elijah. "Elijah Carter tutored my son in math when everyone else had given up on him. He never asked for anything in return. That's the kind of man he was. Hashtag justice for Elijah. I served with Staff Sergeant Carter. He saved my life in Afghanistan. Race never mattered to him, only doing what was right. Hashtag stand with the Carters. Remember when Elijah organized that fundraiser for the homeless shelter? Raised thousands of dollars, and then volunteered there himself. This town lost a hero. Hashtag remember Elijah." The hashtag spread beyond the local community, drawing national attention. News outlets began picking up the story, framing it as a microcosm of larger societal issues. Maya sat in her room, scrolling through the posts on her phone. "Dad," she called out, "people are sharing their stories about Elijah. Look at this one. It's from his old football coach." James read the post, his eyes misting. "Your brother touched so many lives. He never talked about it, just quietly went about helping others. That's why Mrs. Whitaker's words hurt so much," Maya said softly. "She didn't know him at all. Didn't want to know him. Just judged him based on, 'I know, baby. I know.'" James hugged his daughter close. Later that night, James stood alone in the backyard. The stars twinkled overhead, the same stars he used to watch with Elijah when his son was young. They'd lay on the grass, talking about life, dreams, the future. "I hope you know how much you're loved, Elijah," he whispered to the night sky. "How many lives you touched. How proud you made us." A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, the one Elijah had climbed countless times as a child. James could almost hear his son's laughter on the wind. Inside, Angela had finally fallen asleep, Elijah's letters still clutched in her hands. Maya sat at her desk, writing in her journal, processing her emotions the way her brother had taught her. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of remembrance, of love, of family holding onto each other through the storm. The community continued its vigil in the park, the candles burning bright against the darkness. Mrs. Whitaker's lights went out one by one, but she remained at her window, watching. The weight of the day's events, the consequences of her actions, began to settle over her like a heavy cloak. As midnight approached, the Carter house stood peaceful under the starlit sky. A gentle wind stirred the American flag on their porch, the flag Elijah had died protecting. In the distance, the last few vigil keepers made their way home, their candles extinguished, but their resolve strengthened. This day had changed them all. The ripples of Mrs. Whitaker's actions and the Carters' response would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond their small community. But for now, in the quiet of night, a father gazed at the stars, a mother clutched her son's letters, and a sister wrote her memories, each holding on to their piece of Elijah's legacy in their own way. The weight of pain was heavy, but so was the weight of love. And in the end, love would prove the stronger force. The morning news played on Eleanor Whitaker's television, but she barely registered it until she heard her own name. The anchor's voice was professionally neutral, but her eyes held clear disapproval. In local news, controversy continues to grow over the disruption of Staff Sergeant Elijah Carter's funeral. Eleanor Whitaker, a resident of Pine Grove, made racist remarks during the service, causing outrage in the community and beyond. The video of the incident has now gone viral. Mrs. Whitaker's hand trembled as she reached for the remote, but she couldn't bring herself to turn it off. The screen showed clips from the funeral. Her own face twisted with hatred, James Carter's dignified response, Maya's tears. Her phone buzzed again. Another text message from a former Bridge Club member. Please remove yourself from our group chat. Your behavior was unconscionable. She deleted it, along with dozens of others like it. Her social media accounts had become a battlefield of condemnation. Local news websites had published opinion pieces about her, and even national outlets had picked up the story as an example of persistent racism in America. They're making me out to be a monster, she muttered to herself, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. The doorbell rang, a rare sound these days. Mrs. Whitaker hurried to answer it, hope flickering in her chest. But it was just a delivery man with a package. He thrust it at her, without meeting her eyes, barely waiting for her signature before hurrying away. Later that afternoon, Martha Coleman, her closest friend of 20 years, called. Eleanor. Martha's voice was heavy with disappointment. I've been trying to find the right words for days. Martha, surely you understand. No, Eleanor, I don't understand. I can't understand how you could do something so cruel. That young man died serving our country. His family was grieving. I was just speaking my mind. No, you were speaking your prejudice. And I can't associate with that kind of hatred anymore. Goodbye, Eleanor. The line went dead. Mrs. Whitaker stared at the phone, her hands shaking. Martha had been her confidant, her weekly lunch companion, her last real friend in town. Now she too was gone. Alone in her house, Mrs. Whitaker wandered from room to room, the silence pressing in around her. In her bedroom, her eyes fell on a silver-framed photograph she usually avoided looking at. Her late husband Richard stood with his warm smile and genuine eyes. She picked up the frame, dust falling from its edges. What would you think of me now, Richard? She whispered. For the first time, a flicker of guilt crossed her face. He'd never tolerated prejudice in their home. The next morning, necessity forced her to venture out to the grocery store. She'd been putting it off, but her cupboards were bare. As she pushed her cart down the aisles, the whispers followed her. That's her, the one from the funeral. Can't believe she shows her face in public. My brother served with Sergeant Carter. Said he was one of the finest men he'd ever known. People moved away as she approached, like she carried some contagious disease. At the meat counter, the butcher who'd always chatted with her about recipes merely asked, "What do you want?" in a clipped tone, his usual smile nowhere to be seen. In the produce section, she reached for a bunch of bananas at the same time as Sarah Mitchell. Sarah immediately withdrew her hand as if burned. "Sarah," Mrs. Whitaker said desperately, "surely we can still be civil." Sarah's eyes were cold. "Civil? Like you were at Elijah's funeral? That boy used to mow my lawn, refused to take payment. Said it was his way of helping an elderly neighbor. He was worth 10 of you, Eleanor." At the checkout, the young cashier, someone she'd known since he was a child, wouldn't meet her eyes. He scanned her items in silence, speaking only to mutter the total. When she tried to hand him cash, he flinched away from her touch. Sunday morning brought another shock. Mrs. Whitaker had attended First Baptist Church for 40 years, had taught Sunday school, had organized bake sales. She walked up the familiar steps, clutching her Bible like a shield. Reverend Johnson met her at the door. His face was kind but firm. "Eleanor," he said softly, I think it's best if you don't attend services for a while." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're turning me away from God's house?" "No, Eleanor. God's house is open to all who come with an open heart. But this is also a place of respect, not division. Your actions have deeply hurt this congregation. Until you're ready to truly reflect on that and make amends, your presence here will only cause pain. But I've attended this church longer than you've been alive. Then you should understand better than most what it means to love thy neighbor. All thy neighbors, Eleanor. Please, take some time to pray and reflect on your actions." She turned away, tears of humiliation burning in her eyes. As she walked home, she passed the park where the vigil for Elijah had been held. The temporary memorial had grown. Flowers, flags, notes, and pictures covered the space. A group of young people were maintaining it, replacing wilted flowers with fresh ones. One of them looked up as she passed. "My brother served with Sergeant Carter," the young man called out. "He said your kind of hatred was exactly what they were fighting against." Back home, Mrs. Whitaker stood at her window, watching life continue without her. Children played in the street. Neighbors chatted on porches. Families returned from church. No one looked her way. No one waved. No one stopped to talk. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Her daughter's name flashed on the screen. Relief flooded through her as she answered. "Catherine, sweetheart." "Don't sweetheart me, Mother." Catherine's voice was tight with anger. "Michael showed me the video." "How could you?" "Catherine, please." "No, Mother." "Do you know what this means for us? For your grandchildren?" "Michael's best friend at school is black. How do I explain to him what his grandmother did?" Mrs. Whitaker sank into her chair. "I was just what? Being racist at a soldier's funeral? A soldier who died protecting your freedom to spew hatred? David and I have talked it over. We need some distance. The children won't be visiting for a while. Catherine, please, you're all I have left. Maybe you should have thought of that before. Goodbye, Mother." The line went dead. Mrs. Whitaker's hands trembled so badly, she dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor as the first real sob escaped her throat. She spent the rest of the day in her husband's study, a room she'd kept locked since his death. "Oh, Richard," she whispered, "what have I become?" As evening fell, she found herself drawn to her window again. The Carter house was lit up, cars parked outside. Through the windows, she could see people gathering, supporting each other, sharing memories, healing together. In her own dark house, the silence was deafening. No friends would come to visit. No family would call to check on her. No neighbors would bring casseroles or stop to chat. She had built this isolation herself, brick by brick, with every prejudiced thought, every racist comment, every moment of hatred. For the first time, her proud posture slumped. She sank into her chair, the weight of her actions, her beliefs, her lifetime of prejudice crushing down on her. In the growing darkness, she finally faced the truth about herself, and the reflection made her weep. The tears came slowly at first, then in racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the pain she'd caused, for the relationships she'd destroyed, for the humanity she'd denied in others and lost in herself. But mostly, she cried because she finally understood what she'd done, not just at the funeral, but throughout her life. As night fell completely, Eleanor Whitaker sat alone in her dark house, facing the consequences of a lifetime of hatred. The sharp sting of remorse had finally pierced her armor of prejudice, leaving her to wonder if it was too late to change, too late to make amends, too late to become the person her husband would have wanted her to be. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that James Carter had spoken to about his son, the same stars that had watched over Elijah Carter as he made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. And in their cold, distant light, Mrs. Whitaker began the long, painful process of confronting her own heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor Whitaker's living room as she paced back and forth, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of neglect. Her silver hair, normally perfectly coiffed, hung limp around her face. Dark circles under her eyes testified to sleepless nights spent wrestling with her conscience. She stopped at the window, watching the Carter house across the street. In the week since the funeral, she'd observed their daily routines from behind her curtains. James leaving for work each morning, Maya heading to school, Angela tending to the garden where Elijah had once helped her plant roses. I have to do this, she whispered to herself, touching the window pane. I have to try. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized anymore. Gone was the proud, defiant stance. Instead, she saw someone diminished by the weight of their own actions. Her husband's photo sat on the side table, his eyes seeming to watch her with disappointment. I know, Richard, she said to the photo. I know what I have to do. It took her 3 attempts to leave her house. The first time, she reached the front door before her courage failed. The second time, she made it to her garden gate before turning back. On the third try, she forced herself to keep walking, her legs shaking with each step. The short distance between their houses had never seemed so long. Neighbors working in their yard stopped to stare as she passed. She heard whispers behind raised hands, but kept her eyes fixed on her destination. Mrs. Whitaker's heart pounded as she climbed the Carter's porch steps. The American flag still flew at half-mast, and fresh flowers decorated the entrance. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, followed by footsteps. Through the decorative glass panels, she could see figures moving. The door opened, and James Carter stood before her, his tall frame filling the doorway. His expression was guarded but composed, his eyes studying her face. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, his voice neutral. Behind him, in the hallway, Angela and Maya appeared. Maya's face hardened at the sight of her, while Angela placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Whitaker began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Mr. Carter, I needed to speak with you. With all of you. She could see the internal debate playing across his face. The instinct to protect his family warring with the principles of compassion his son had embodied. Finally, he nodded once. Say what you came to say. Mrs. Whitaker's carefully prepared speech deserted her. Instead, raw truth spilled from her lips. I was wrong, she said, her voice cracking. I was so terribly wrong. The things I said at Elijah's funeral, the way I've behaved, the person I've been. Tears began to fall, but she forced herself to continue. I shouldn't have said those things. Any of them. Ever. Maya shifted in the hallway, her expression skeptical. Angela's face remained unreadable, but her grip on Maya's shoulder tightened slightly. I've spent the past week looking at myself, really looking, Mrs. Whitaker continued. At who I am, at what I believe, at why I believe it. I've lost my family, my friends, my place in the community. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I finally understand the pain I've caused. The hurt, the damage. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a crumpled tissue, dabbing at her eyes. James Carter remained silent, but something in his expression shifted slightly. I know this doesn't fix anything, Mrs. Whitaker said. I know I can't take back what I said or erase the hurt I've caused. I know there's no excuse for my behavior or my beliefs. I needed you to know that I understand now. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, James Carter spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I forgive you, he said, causing Maya to gasp softly behind him. Not for what you said, but for Elijah and for myself. Holding on to hate only deepens the wound. My son understood that better than most. Mrs. Whitaker's shoulders sagged with relief, but James wasn't finished. However, he continued, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean we want anything to do with you. Some wounds take more than words to heal, Mrs. Whitaker. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. She nodded, her face pale and strained. I understand. Do you? Maya suddenly stepped forward, her voice tight with emotion. Do you understand what it felt like to hear you dishonor my brother's memory? To hear you dismiss his sacrifice? To know that you looked at him and saw only the color of his skin, not the content of his character? Maya, Angela said softly, but Maya shook her head. No, Mom. She needs to hear this. Elijah was the best person I knew. He protected people who couldn't protect themselves. He stood up against hatred and prejudice. He died serving a country where people like you still exist, still judge him, still hate him without knowing him. And he did it anyway, because he believed things could be better. He believed people could be better. Mrs. Whitaker absorbed each word like a physical blow, tears streaming down her face. Your apology doesn't fix that, Maya continued. It doesn't bring him back. It doesn't erase the hurt you caused at his funeral. It doesn't make up for a lifetime of hatred. You're right, Mrs. Whitaker whispered. You're absolutely right. James placed a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. That's enough, sweetheart. Mrs. Whitaker straightened her shoulders slightly, gathering what dignity she had left. Thank you for listening to me. I'll go now. She turned and walked away, her steps slow and uncertain, her shoulders hunched under the weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Behind her, she heard the door close with a quiet finality. Inside the Carter home, Maya turned to her father, tears spilling down her cheeks. Did we do the right thing? James opened his arms, and Maya fell into them, releasing a sob she'd been holding back. You did the right thing, she whispered against his chest, showing mercy when she showed none. That's what Elijah would have done. Angela joined them, wrapping her arms around both her husband and daughter. Elijah would be proud of you, she whispered to James. So proud. You showed strength and forgiveness, just like he always did. The family stood there in their embrace, drawing comfort from each other. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beams, illuminating the photos of Elijah that lined their walls. In each one, he smiled that warm, confident smile that had made him so beloved. I feel lighter, Maya admitted after a while, wiping her eyes. Like I can breathe a little easier. That's what forgiveness does, James said softly. It frees us from the weight of hatred. Your brother understood that. He lived it every day. Angela touched the military photo of Elijah on the wall. He always said that the hardest battle wasn't against any enemy. It was against the hatred in our own hearts. He won that battle, Maya said firmly. Every single day, he won it. 3 months after Elijah's funeral, the Carter family sat in a circle with other military families at the local community center. The room was warm and welcoming, photos of fallen soldiers lining the walls, their smiles frozen in time. My name is James, Mr. Carter began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. My son, Staff Sergeant Elijah Carter, was killed in action 3 months ago. He paused, squeezing Angela's hand. Some days, the grief feels like a physical weight. Other days, you can breathe again, finished an elderly woman across the circle. My Tommy's been gone 5 years now. It doesn't go away, but it changes, becomes something you can carry. Angela nodded, tears in her eyes. That's exactly it. Sometimes I feel guilty when I laugh or have a good moment, like I'm betraying his memory. Oh, honey, another mother reached over to touch her knee. Our children lived with joy. They'd want us to do the same. The support group became a weekly anchor for the Carters, a place where their grief was understood without explanation. Each meeting brought new insights, new ways of carrying their loss, new friendships forged in shared pain. Meanwhile, the community had rallied around an idea proposed by Sarah Mitchell, a memorial garden in the local park. What started as a simple suggestion grew into a town-wide project. Local businesses donated materials, landscapers offered their services, and volunteers showed up daily to help with the work. The centerpiece would be a granite wall engraved with the names of fallen soldiers from their town. Elijah's name would be the most recent addition, but not the only one. The garden would honor all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. We want it to be a place of peace, Sarah explained to the Carters as they reviewed the plans. Somewhere people can come to remember, to reflect, to heal. The design included winding paths, benches for quiet contemplation, and flowering trees that would bloom in spring. But it was the children's contribution that touched the Carters most deeply. A series of painted rocks, each bearing a message of hope or gratitude, that would line the paths. Maya found her own way of honoring her brother's memory. Inspired by her father's response to Mrs. Whitaker, she started speaking at local schools about tolerance, unity, and standing up against hatred. My brother used to say that courage isn't about being fearless, she told a group of high school students. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. He lived those values every day, not just on the battlefield. Her youth program, Standing Tall Like Elijah, quickly gained momentum. Teenagers from different backgrounds came together to discuss their experiences, challenge their prejudices, and work on community service projects. Elijah would love this, James told Maya after one particularly successful meeting. Seeing young people breaking down barriers, learning to see each other as human beings first. I learned it from him, Dad, Maya replied, her eyes shining. And from you. The way you handled everything with Mrs. Whitaker. That was its own kind of courage. Angela found her calling at the Military Family Support Foundation. What started as occasional volunteer work became a full-time commitment. She counseled newly bereaved families, organized care packages for deployed soldiers, and shared Elijah's story with those who needed hope. Your son sounds like an exceptional young man, a newly widowed military wife told her one day. He was, Angela replied, touching the gold star pin on her lapel. But what made him exceptional wasn't just his service or his sacrifice. It was his heart, his belief in people's capacity for good, even when they showed him their worst. In his garage workshop, James discovered solace in wood carving, a hobby he and Elijah had shared. His first project was a simple eagle, its wings spread wide, soaring toward the sky. Each piece after that told a story: a soldier's helmet, a folded flag, a pair of boots. Remember how he used to say, "I was too perfectionist with my carvings"? James asked Angela one evening, showing her his latest work, a detailed rendering of Elijah's dog tags. "He'd tease you about spending hours on a single feather." Angela smiled, running her fingers over the smooth wood. But he was just as bad. Remember that chess set he carved for Maya's birthday? The community support continued to pour in, often in unexpected ways. Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store would leave fresh flowers on their porch every Sunday. Mr. Thompson, Elijah's old high school teacher, shared stories about how Elijah had tutored struggling students in his free time. "He noticed I was having trouble in physics," one former classmate told them. "Just showed up one day and said, 'Let's figure this out together.' Wouldn't take any payment. Just asked me to help someone else when I could." The local news station did a follow-up story, focusing not on the controversy of the funeral, but on Elijah's life and legacy. The reporter interviewed people whose lives he had touched, fellow soldiers, community members, even an Afghan child he had helped get medical care during his deployment. Staff Sergeant Carter represented the best of what America can be, his commanding officer said in the interview. He didn't just talk about values like equality and justice. He lived them. He died protecting those values. The story went viral, inspiring similar initiatives in other communities. Schools began incorporating lessons about tolerance and understanding into their curricula. Military support groups reached out to learn more about Maya's youth program. 6 months after the funeral, the memorial garden was ready for dedication. The entire town gathered for the ceremony, the autumn sun casting golden light across the newly planted flowers. The granite wall gleamed, each name etched with care and respect. The Carters stood together, their hands linked, as the mayor made his speech. James wore the eagle pin he had carved, Angela her gold star, Maya a bracelet woven from Elijah's bootlaces. "This garden," the mayor said, "represents more than remembrance. It represents hope. Hope that from loss can come healing. That from division can come unity. That from darkness can come light." After the ceremony, people lingered in the garden, sharing memories and quiet moments of reflection. The Carters made their way to the wall, where Elijah's name caught the late afternoon sun. Maya reached out, tracing the letters with her finger. "You're always with us, Elijah," she whispered. Angela leaned against James, their arms around each other. "Look at all of this," she said softly. "All these people, all this love. He helped create this, even after he was gone." "That was Elijah," James replied, his voice thick with emotion, but also pride. "Always bringing people together, always making things better." A gentle breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of fresh flowers and new beginnings. The painted rocks along the path sparkled with messages of hope. "Love wins. Be the light. Stand tall." From her window across town, Mrs. Whitaker watched the evening news coverage of the dedication ceremony one last time. The moving truck outside her house was almost fully loaded. She saw the Carters standing together on the television screen, saw the community gathered in support, saw the physical manifestation of love triumphing over hatred. Her hand trembled as she sealed an envelope containing an anonymous check for the garden's maintenance fund and a note asking it to be delivered after she was gone. The for sale sign in her front yard had attracted little attention. No one in town wanted to buy the house of the woman who had disrupted a soldier's funeral. Finally, a couple from 2 states away, unaware of the house's history, had made an offer. As she carried her last box to the truck, neighbors went about their business without a glance her way. No one came to say goodbye. No one wished her well. Her departure was met with the same cold silence that had surrounded her these past months. It felt fitting somehow. She had isolated herself long before the community had isolated her. She took one final look at her home of 40 years, then climbed into her car. As she drove away, she caught a glimpse of the memorial garden in her rearview mirror, its new granite wall gleaming in the sunset. The shame and guilt would follow her to her new home, but at least there, she wouldn't have to see the daily reminders of her actions. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the memorial garden. Most of the crowd had dispersed, but the Carters remained, sharing this moment together. You know what Elijah would say if he could see all this? Maya asked, a small smile playing on her lips. What's that, sweetheart? Angela asked. See? I told you love was stronger than hate. James chuckled softly. That's exactly what he'd say. They stood there as darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the sky. The same stars Elijah had looked up at from distant battlefields, the same stars that had watched over his return home, the same stars that now witnessed his family carrying his legacy forward. In the gentle evening light, the garden seemed to glow with its own inner peace. The waters of the small fountain burbled quietly, wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a bugler played taps. The Carters finally turned to leave, their steps slow but steady. They had honored Elijah not just in death, but in the way they chose to live, with dignity, with courage, with love. And in doing so, they had helped their community heal, had shown that even in the darkest moments, light could still shine through. As they walked home together, the stars continued to twinkle overhead, eternal witnesses to the enduring power of love over hate, of unity over division, of hope over despair. Elijah's spirit lived on, not just in the garden or in their memories, but in every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every step toward a better world. That was his true legacy, not just as a soldier, but as a son, a brother, and a beacon of hope for all who knew him. And in carrying that legacy forward, his family had found not just healing, but purpose. Not just closure, but new beginnings. Not just peace, but the strength to keep standing tall, just as Elijah had taught them. Elijah Carter's story isn't just about loss. It's about how choosing love over hate can heal wounds and bring people together. What would you do if faced with such deep-seated prejudice? How would you handle forgiveness? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, as Elijah believed, standing tall against hatred can change not just one life, but an entire community. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more tales that touch the soul.